Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
When I was a boy, my mother and I lived with my grandfather, who had a farmhouse in a rural location in southwestern Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a handyman who also worked a small blacksmith shop in his old barn. My grandmother had died before I was born, and my father had also passed away while serving overseas in the U.S. Army. Beginning in the summer of 1946, we noticed strange howling sounds coming from the woods that surrounded the property. The activity came at night and was very frightening when the howling came close. The sounds didn't seem to bother my grandfather, though my mother and I were shaken when it would begin. The sounds continued off and on for about a year, but we never noticed any animals. My grandfather and I would hunt for deer and squirrels in the woods during the colder months, but we never saw signs of unusual animal activity. One late afternoon in the spring of 1947, I was helping my grandfather in his shop when I noticed something moving around the edge of the woods near an area where my grandfather had a few junk cars and other items. It was about 200 feet from our location, but I clearly noticed someone or something moving around. I told my grandfather to look. He walked to the door, lit his pipe, and said nothing. After a minute or two, he turned around and got back to work. About that time, this thing moved into the woods and disappeared. I couldn't judge how big it was, but it sort of reminded me of a magazine picture I had seen of a large ape that was said to inhabit the Asian jungles. Later that evening, I told my mother what I had seen. She was shocked because she knew I wouldn't lie to her and that the howling sounds had been closer lately. I also told her of my grandfather's response when I pointed the creature out to him. She immediately stood up and walked into the sitting room in order to ask my grandfather what it was. He started to shake his head slowly and said that he was hoping that we wouldn't see it because he was worried we would be scared and leave him. After assuring him that we'd never leave him, my mother again insisted that he tell us what this creature was. He looked away, took a deep breath, and said it's a dark walker, and said that it had lived in the woods for many years. He said the native Indians called it stone spirit, and they thought that it was an evil spirit who would appear when someone was about to die. The last time he had seen the dark walker was the night before my grandmother died. My mother was skeptical of the harbinger of death angel, but she sensed that there was something unnatural nearby. The howling continued each night, though we hadn't seen any signs of the dark walker. One warm evening, we were sitting on the back porch. There were a few howls, but it seemed like the sounds were further away. We were listening to the radio when all at once my grandfather stood up and looked out towards the barn. He turned to me and said,
"John, go get my pistol and ammo. Hurry now."
I ran into the sitting room and grabbed the .455 Webley revolver and a handful of bullets from the old steamer trunk. I handed it to him and watched him load the gun. He then picked up a hatchet and slid it in his pants belt.
"Now both of you get into the house, now."
We were in the kitchen looking through the screen door and watched my grandfather walk slowly towards the barn. We saw him turn and walk out of sight into the dark. I decided to grab my shotgun and keep it nearby. After a minute or so, we heard 3 gunshots and a blood-curdling scream emanate from the woods near the barn. Then it suddenly stopped and there was complete quiet. We were frozen and wondering if we should go look for my grandfather. A few seconds later, we heard him yell, "Stay in the house until I come back." I heard the pickup truck start up. I looked out the storage room window and saw my grandfather drive to the back of the barn and park. Several minutes later, he backed up and drove by the side of the house out onto the road. I could see that there was something in the back covered up with a tarp. It was getting late, so my mother told me to go to bed. The next morning, I came downstairs and sat beside my grandfather, who was reading the newspaper and drinking a cup of coffee. My mother was sitting at the other end of the table staring at my grandfather. Not long later, she said, "Well, Dad, tell him." My grandfather put the paper down and looked at me.
"I killed the Dark Walker."
That was all he said. My mother told me not to tell anyone and that the matter was closed. We never talked about it again. My grandfather lived another 15 years and my mother stayed with him until his dying day. When I grew older, I moved away and raised a family. I would return home to visit each summer and never heard another howl.
This incident occurred on Christmas night 2007 at our family home in upstate New York. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2 p.m. we all sat down to eat and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8 p.m., after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took back roads to get there. So I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the roads surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives, or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights on in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour down to 20. There were no streetlights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in place every 30 feet or so for a bit. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music when driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car, and it were exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on 2 long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong-looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-colored, not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin that wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off its back. I don't know what this was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. And it had pointed things atop its head, 2 things going straight upward with something mingled between the 2 things. That's what I got from a quick scan and from my observation of it as it neared my car and my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth open wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. Gives me the chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill shriek enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. Called him to tell him what happened and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get back home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sank in. Had my driver's side window been open fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was.
I thought we had a poltergeist problem in my parents' house. When we lived back east, I had a stalker who would prowl around my parents' house, then mine. He smoked. When you live in a state of siege for so many years, just the reminder of something that a stalker did is enough to cause you to be terrified. I kept telling my mother there was no logical reason for her to smell cigarette smoke in the hallway of the house they had purchased in another state. Didn't make sense. With all the stress of dealing with my father's Alzheimer's, I found myself thinking about poltergeist. When you buy a house, a complete history should go along with it. It should be required by law. It took years for me to discover that 2 people had died on the property. One young man was working on the power lines and was electrocuted. Another died outside of the house. The people who sold the house to my parents did not smoke. The woman had a serious care of persons with dementia in their environment problem. Other people smelled the smoke. Things started disappearing, then reappearing. Once again, when you are dealing with Alzheimer's, the logical answer was that my father picked something up and who knows what happened to it. My mother finally locked up the television remotes. I've been told the most common cause of TV remotes disappearing is due to people with Alzheimer's hiding them. People with Alzheimer's will quite often have a secret stash of something. I have a friend who had an ex-husband who was scoring Viagra, going around doctors shopping for it. He would go to his doctor's appointments and the situation with nurses was horrible. Finally, when he was accepted into the VA, my friend and her son started packing up things and discovered hundreds of stashed Viagra tablets. My father died in October 2014. We have yet to find everything, including my mother's diamond wedding band, which was there 1 minute and gone the next. We have gone through every drawer, every possible hiding place. The titles of the cars have disappeared. He put them somewhere. I thought I'd cleaned out his old safe, getting what was valuable, but I missed the car titles. I have a friend who was interested in possibly purchasing the property. We were talking about it and I told her that the house was haunted. The problem, I told her, was that I couldn't figure out who it was. The problem was annoying, not frightening, just plain annoying. My friend knew who the person was. She had known her for years. She thinks she died in the house of natural causes. The woman was a notorious practical jokester. I was told there was no prank too simple or too outrageous. She once said if she could pick her idea of heaven, it would be to come back as an annoying ghost and drive people crazy by pranking them. That is exactly what she does. I'm beginning to wonder if, the next time I go down to the house, asking her to return my mother's ring. It's worth a try. Something else that still baffles me is the appearance of my father's military records. He was in the Merchant Marines during World War II. It wasn't until the 1980s that they were given VA status. We couldn't find my father's records. I have looked for them all those years. A week after he died, I was going through some of his things. On his old oak desk was a large plastic bag, at least 2 inches thick, with every single record, including medals, pay stubs, his passport, and even letters. It's all there. My sister and nephew had been going through storage. They did not even go near his desk. Neither had the other person who would care for him. My mother certainly did not do it. There is no logical explanation for why they appeared. Also, my father inherited my grandfather's old tractor, which he used, for a good 40 years, to mow grass, with a golf course mower. When we reached the point where he could no longer operate it, a family friend took over the mowing. He knows how to fix the old tractor, or did. The tractor basically quit running when my father died. No matter how he tinkers, our friend cannot get it to work. Their yard is a mess, with the old tractor sitting outside, rusting. It's like that song about the grandfather clock.
Okay, so this is my story. I was 15, was at my boyfriend's house, and it was about 10:30 p.m. We were sitting on his trampoline, in his backyard, which faces a small park behind his house. His yard is on a ground level about a meter above the ground level the park is on, and his fence is on that lower level, so by sitting on the trampoline we could see out into the darkness of the park, which was just slightly illuminated by his yard lights. We're talking when suddenly I feel an eerie chill, like we're being watched. Like something wants us to know we're being watched. I remember glancing all over the place and jumping at the smallest sounds of the night, boyfriend laughing at me, and all before he suddenly stilled and rose up onto his knees to look at something in the park. There's a man watching us from that tree. Jesus, those words still chill me to the core. I froze, and asked him to tell me what he was doing. He told me that the man was very tall, almost halfway up the tree, which was a large eucalyptus. We live in Queensland, Australia, and that only his head and shoulder were really visible and that his eyes were glowing, or reflecting the light from his yard lights. I wondered if he was lying and making fun of me again for being paranoid earlier, so I sat up and leaned over him to see the thing next to the tree. There it was. It was tall, darker than the shadows of the trees, and wasn't lit up like the trees were from the lights. Its eyes were shining brightly, and it was exceptionally tall. Couldn't be a man, if not for the shoulder and arm draped over the tree, and so was not an animal either. I fell back onto the trampoline and my boyfriend told me to be quiet, and to start moving back towards the house. It was moving towards us. I shook my head. I did not want to move. I couldn't bring myself to move. I was frozen in fear. I don't know, but I remember he had to force me up, swearing loudly and telling me it was nearly at the fence. I got up and caught a glance of a figure nearly across the short distance from the trees to his yard and booked it to the stairs up to his front door. I glanced back to look again and my boyfriend yelled not to, that it was climbing over the fence, and I somehow moved even faster and made it to the door without tripping up the stairs and breaking a leg. He told me again it had been trying to climb over the fence when I slowed down to take a look. His family is very religious and his father swears it was a demon trying to test their faith or some bull, but I don't think it was. Had another encounter maybe a month later when my boyfriend told me a figure was watching me from exposed ceiling beams of my old barn-like house during a FaceTime call late at night. Maybe a shadow man? Maybe an Australian version of a skinwalker? I am 19 now, and I still can't stop thinking about what happened. If anyone knows what this sort of aggressive, stalker behavior means and what creature this was, please let me know. It was definitely not just some creepy man. This shadowy thing was at least 3 meters tall, 9-ish feet, and had bright glowing white eyes.
I want to share one of the bizarre experiences I had about 10 years ago. At the time, I lived in rural southeast Georgia in Ware County. My friends and I, being dumb, bored teenagers, loved to explore old and abandoned places. Well, one night we learned of an old colonial graveyard that was deep in the woods about an hour or so out of town from a group of ghost hunting family members. We heard legends of witches being hanged and buried there, just outside of the cemetery grounds. There had also been lynchings of black folks in the darker days of Southern history. We drive along the highway for a while until we find the unmarked dirt road. We turned down this empty road and drove for about 5 minutes until it dead ends at a small sheet metal shelter. We could see the headstones of the cemetery in the pale headlights. So, happy at finding our destination, we jump out of our friend's convertible and we grab our flashlights from the trunk. We then go about exploring the graveyard as we usually did. It was quite an interesting place. The families that lived in the area still used the graveyard, so part of the cemetery was well maintained. As you ventured more and more back in time, the forest had slowly retaken the grounds. So, in order to get deep into the old sections, you had to climb over dense trees and brush. We were there for about an hour or so exploring. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. The only scary thing about the place was the foreboding atmosphere and the reflected eyes of forest critters watching us from the dark forest. After an hour of exploring, it was getting late and we decided to start on our hour drive back home. The night was cool, and we had the top of the convertible down. I was sitting in the back seat with my friend SW, and Jay were up front in the driver and passenger seat. We had only left the cemetery not 20 seconds before, but I decided to look back and watch the retreating landscape, which is when I saw something quite peculiar. A glowing ball of light was following us. I stare at this thing for a good 10 to 20 seconds just trying to make out what it could be. It hovered about 10 feet off the road and showed brilliant light that illuminated the forest around it, 30 plus feet area. It was slowly gaining on us as we were making our way slowly down the pitch-black road. We rounded a curve in the road and I watched it navigate the same turn in the road. At this point I turn and alert S, who turns and stares at it. Confirming that I wasn't crazy, we then alerted J and W to our stalker. J stops the car and we all turn around again and watch as this ball of light is making its way towards us. At this point, all hell breaks loose as J and W freak out and J slams his foot on the accelerator. W, not really thinking clearly, pulled a BB pistol out from under his seat and began to load it. We quickly outpaced whatever it was and we soon pulled out onto the old highway. J didn't stop until we got back to his house. I don't know what the hell that light was, but a series of unfortunate and unexplained events befell each of us over the next 2 years. I have wondered if we had disturbed a malevolent entity while in the cemetery.
I was black powder hunting alone in a very rural area in Grayson County, Kentucky, far off the parkway. An off-grid property with old-growth timber surrounding it for many miles in every direction, with just a few seasonal hunting cabins that lie dormant most of the year. I've deer hunted this property all my life and had never had any reason to fear walking into my deer stand in the dark, until the 2008 season changed my life forever. I always rode my four-wheeler in and parked 250 yards outside of my favorite spot and walked the rest of the way in to not spook any game before I got to my stand. So as I shut my four-wheeler off and put on my backpack, I heard a very large limb snap and thought it was a deer or animal moving around maybe 20 yards away. So I didn't think anything about it. I just figured I had spooked an animal inside the woods. So I gathered my gun and hunting stuff and started walking down the 2-track trail without my flashlight on due to having good enough light from the moon to see where I was walking. I hunted here a long time and knew the trail. This trail ended in a 15-acre hayfield surrounded by old-growth timber. As I walked in the dark, I started to realize something was paralleling my every step just inside the woods. I walked and stopped, and it would do the same. As I moved along the dark trail, the footsteps started getting closer to me. I wasn't sure, but it sounded like it was bipedal. By the time I realized I had a serious situation on my hands, it was too far and too late to make it back to the four-wheeler safely, so I picked up my pace and made a beeline for the field. I got to the field with my stalker pacing my every step. I moved swiftly towards my stand 75 yards down the edge of the woods. When I got within 10 yards from the stand, I heard another large limb snap really close to the edge of the field on my left. I stopped, turned my flashlight on, and shined in that direction. I observed two glowing green eyes about 10 inches apart. Instinctively, I raised my hands in the air and yelled, "Get out of here." I stomped my foot at it, not really sure what I was seeing. It just blinks its eyes once and never moves. I could not make out any details, just that it may have been crouched down due to the proximity of the eyes to the ground. Whatever this was didn't run like most non-predatory animals would do. I realized in that instant the best thing to do was take the high ground and get in the stand as quickly as possible. This, whatever it was no more than 8 steps away, and if I shot at it in the dark, I would have been blinded by the muzzle flash and it might attack if I missed. And with only one shot, I knew I would be in trouble if it did attack. I climbed up the ladder like a squirrel. I watched, listened, and waited for what seemed an eternity for daybreak. This thing circled me in my stand just out of the reach of my flashlight for over an hour. I am not ashamed to admit I was scared, but I remained calm and knew the only way it could get to me was on the ladder, and I felt comfort in knowing it had to climb up the ladder to get to me, but didn't seem to know exactly how to utilize it. At one point, in the dark, I heard what sounded like a small rock bounce off the lower end of the metal ladder. I waited with my gun at the ready, and I would have done whatever it took to stay alive and wasn't going without a fight. I could see a shadow moving, but in the dark you never know if your eyes are playing tricks on you. But I could sense a real threat lurking in the dark field surrounding my deer stand. For whatever reason, this thing was stalking me and did so until just a few seconds before daybreak. I heard its footsteps fade into the woods where it had followed me from. I waited, watched, and listened intently until full daylight, and descended cautiously down the ladder on high alert. As I walked back to my four-wheeler, I knew this thing wasn't gone but hiding inside the forest, watching my every move. I moved across the field quickly and waited and listened before heading down the 2 tracks surrounded on both sides with trees. I knew this would be a perfect ambush spot with close quarters and not much room to evade or fight off an attack of any kind. I unsnapped my hunting knife sheath, got a firm grip on my black powder rifle, and went for broke, ready for battle of life or death. As I rounded the corner where my four-wheeler was sitting, I saw my escape and wasted no time jumping on the machine. As I turned the key and reached to hit the starter button, I heard another branch or limb snap with great force somewhere behind me. The bike fired up and I goosed the throttle hard, going through the gears as fast as I could, never looking back. To be honest, I didn't want to know what it was and was just relieved I had escaped a close call. I got back to my cabin, packed up and left the area, and went back home and cut the week-long hunt short. I didn't return until the following spring. I've often thought about this experience, and since I realized the days leading up to it, I didn't see any wildlife at all. The forest was eerily quiet and no animal activity at all. Was it a Bigfoot, Wendigo, or some sort of cryptid? I don't know, but I do know I experienced it, and I've never been the same when I enter the woods. I changed my hunting tactics, how and when I enter the woods, and always carry a backup sidearm. And I tune into what the creatures in the woods are telling me first and foremost. If the squirrels and the birds are not moving around normally, there is a predator in their midst. And it just might be hunting you as well.
I worked at Keystone Resort in Colorado for a few years. During the summers we would set up for conferences, weddings, and things of that nature. A number of weddings were performed at one of the mountaintop buildings that would be high-end dining/cafeterias in the winter and functions in the summer. Imagine mountaintop beautiful wood buildings with huge stone fireplaces and magnificent vistas off of huge wooden decks. Nice places for your weddings if you can afford it. Anyway, to get to these places required driving along dirt roads that would snake through valleys and then up switchback roads along the mountain until you reached the top and the building in question. It was approximately 8 miles of winding mountain roads. One night we had a quick turnaround, from a conference into a wedding the following afternoon. This required moving lots of tables and chairs out and down the mountain and moving up different tables and chairs for the wedding. So we would have a crew breaking down the previous setup and loading a truck, which would then be driven down to a building that had the other equipment, unloaded and reloaded by the crew there, and then equipment driven back up the mountain. I was the one driving the truck. So here I am driving the long twisty 8-mile drive back up the mountain with my last equipment load. I am about 1.5 miles from my destination, which means I am in the middle of the switchbacks that are weaving their way up the mountain. My truck coughs a few times and then shuts off. I try to restart it, but I get nothing. At this point I am pissed. I have no radio, and now I have to hoof it to the mountaintop building to radio down for another truck. I get out and start walking. I get about 100 yards and I hear something off in the woods. A kind of heavy footfall and some brush snapping. I freeze. The darkness is damn near absolute. This road has no lighting at all, just the little light coming from about a quarter moon. That familiar shiver shoots straight from my lower back right to the top of my head. I am straining to hear anything at all, but I don't hear anything. I start to walk again, trying to walk very softly, and my head keeps moving back and forth trying to catch any slight sound. I get about another 25 yards and the movement in the woods starts up again, sort of shadowing me from uphill and behind me. There are tingles all through my body, my eyes are like dinner plates and my breath is coming in big gasps. I stop and try to look for any movement at all. The movement in the woods stops again. My brain is telling me don't worry. It's a deer or an elk or maybe a bear. My subconscious is screaming Bigfoot. I am trying to maintain my calm, but calm has left the building. I start walking very fast, trying to discern any sounds from behind me. It doesn't take long. The footfalls and the brush being moved through starts up again as I am moving. And that was all she wrote for me. I haul off, running hell-bent on reaching the building in safety before I am slaughtered by the unknown. I hear crashing in the underbrush for about another 15 or 20 seconds. After that, all I can hear is the pounding of my blood in my head and the jolting thuds of my own feet hitting the ground. I have no idea how fast I ran that last 1.5 miles to the building. I was sure that at any moment something was going to grab me out of the darkness. I made it to the safety of the building and dashed inside. Everyone there took one look at me and then sat me down and gave me a big drink from the bar. I must have been white as a ghost. My buddies gave me plenty of crap for being scared, but none of them set foot outside to check out my story. They just radioed for another truck to come and get the stuff out of my broken down vehicle and deliver it the rest of the way. I finished up my shift and got cross-eyed drunk that morning/next day. I've never been so scared in the woods in my life. In case you couldn't tell, I am not an outdoorsy type. I don't hunt or camp. I have no idea what was in the woods that night. My rational side says it's just a big animal. But my paranoia tells me it was something else. Never saw anything. Just heard noise. To this day I still think it was probably just an elk or a bear, but try telling that to yourself when you are all alone in the pitch black woods.
It was around midnight and I had just got home from visiting family, and I was talking with a friend to let him know I was okay when I had seen something large, and wasn't sure what it was. However, I ran into my house cause I had this sick feeling among other emotions I can't really describe. My friend, a Marine, was concerned, so he stayed on the phone with me trying to calm my panic down. However, it only escalated. It seemed to be outside my door, then when I went into another room, there too it was outside my window as if it were stalking me. This went on for a few hours. I tried to stay very quiet as possible and whispered when I talked to my friend. Whatever it was, it had made an abode on the steep hillside behind my house deep in the woods. It used pine trees and appeared almost teepee-like yet very sturdy. When I checked it out days after the event, and there was a stench that's worse than a wet dog. Whatever this thing was, it most definitely was not my imagination. My friend could hear strange noises, grunts, sharp high-pitched sounds that he or I could not explain, nor have ever experienced before. I still don't know what it was. It stays in the shadows. My friend had advised me to leave a peace offering of salt, so I had taken his advice and put out a bowl of salt filled, completely to rim, just to try it out after dinner the next day. Thing is though, the next night, I smelt it first. There was a space under main entrance door, at the rear of the house, cause it was an old farmhouse which in the winter I used to cover it to keep out drafts, then heard the cracking of wood on porch, and I was so frightened that I had hid in the most middle of rooms and stayed low and as still as possible. But whatever it was, it didn't stay long, and in the morning, the whole bowl was gone. Not knocked over, nothing, just gone. No salt trails, nothing. I had checked my security cameras and all I could see was blurred interruptions as if my system was having technical issues, which never happens, but it was a newer camera that I had put in earlier that day. But I have been slowly going through 2 years of 24/7 footage on my older, yet best infrared night vision system I had ever had, but had ran out of recording space since I was on the road much at that time that it was tough to keep up and save important recordings. Also, I had moved down south of Boston, Maine in June and system was in storage, but since I just recently moved 3 weeks ago down the road, and yet into deeper wooded area by the river, from where this incident occurred, I plan on finishing going through all footage with my time and saving anything abnormal that I find for evidence to share in the scientific community. The only description I can give despite it remaining in the shadows is that it's at least 8 to 9 feet tall, lean build, stands tall without hunching much, for all over that is dark, seems to be intelligent, and it stinks. Since I have had this strange experience/encounter with some type of the unknown, I haven't spoken to anyone except my friend, who thinks it's Bigfoot, about this out of fear of ridicule, etc. I don't have psychological issues, yet I have talked to psychiatrists and psychologists, who have all said I am of sound mind, and had all sorts of testing along with PET scans to rule out illness, yet I swear I'm going crazy, but the specialists all said that is normal. I do believe in the unknown, because life, as you know, has much of the unknown still out there hiding or just hasn't been truly documented. Also, I do help others out when they claim they are being haunted, just to help them so they are not afraid to live wherever they are, etc. But that's another topic if you ever wish to discuss that further. Now, back to this unknown creature or hit. Since I have moved in my place, I have been here for several weeks, but the past few days, I have noticed that I am being stalked through the woods. My family had come up for the holiday weekend, and they had noticed the foul, sickening stench, which I had to dismiss it as a mouse that could have passed, and they took that as a logical answer, but the smell would linger and be constant if that were true, and not at night when it keeps coming back. So, whatever it is, it seems to have taken a liking to me, and knows I am back again, which leads me to believe that it has an excellent sense of smell, or it travels much, or both, I don't really know. However, if you wish to investigate, please feel free to contact me anytime, since whatever this is now out there again watching closely, so I would make perfect bait for any investigation. I really do wish that somehow, someone who knows how to document well, would contact me so that this could be properly documented and brought forth to communities, that the truth of unknowns really does exist in our lifetime.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.